What happens when a neighborhood HOA tries to cancel Christmas? One family turns that battle into the brightest story you'll ever hear. In the quiet community of Willow Creek, December usually meant streets filled with laughter, carolers strolling from door to door, and houses glowing with colorful lights. For years, the Miller family's home had been the heart of that magic. Their Christmas displays weren't just decorations. They were an annual tradition. Children from other neighborhoods would beg their parents to drive past the Miller's house to see the sparkling reindeer, the glowing Santa sleigh, and the thousands of twinkling lights that danced in rhythm to festive songs. But this year, something felt different. As Mr. Miller carried boxes of lights down from the attic, his children ran around excitedly, chattering about what colors to use and where the big inflatable snowman should go. Just as they were laying out the first strings of lights on the lawn, a sharp voice cut through the holiday cheer. "Stop right there," said Mrs. Grayson, the HOA president, walking briskly across the street with a clipboard in hand. She wore her authority like armor, and her scowl made the children fall silent. "This year, the HOA has decided there will be no Christmas lights. They're distracting, tacky, and they don't fit the uniform look of our neighborhood. If you put up even a single string, you'll be fined." The Millers stood frozen, shocked by the announcement. For them, the lights weren't about competition or showing off. They were about joy, family, and keeping a tradition alive. Mr. Miller tried to reason with her, gently explaining how much the display meant not only to his family but to the whole community. Mrs. Grayson only tightened her grip on her clipboard. "Rules are rules, and I'll be watching." She turned sharply and marched back to her house, leaving the family stunned in their yard. That night at dinner, the usually cheerful Miller home felt unusually quiet. The children's eyes glistened with disappointment as they asked, "Does this mean no Christmas this year?" Mr. Miller exchanged a glance with his wife. They knew they couldn't let one person steal the season's magic. What the Millers didn't realize, though, was that this would be the beginning of a battle that would divide the neighborhood, test friendships, and end with a showdown no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. The next morning, a bright winter sun spilled across Willow Creek, but inside the Miller household, the mood remained heavy. The children sat at the breakfast table staring at their untouched cereal, while Mrs. Miller tried to lighten the air with cheerful chatter. Mr. Miller, however, sat quietly with a determined look. He wasn't ready to give up. Later that afternoon, he walked over to the HOA office to speak directly with the board. Perhaps, he thought, Mrs. Grayson had spoken out of frustration, and the rest of the board would be more reasonable. The room was filled with 4 board members, all neatly dressed, flipping through files. At the head sat Mrs. Grayson, her sharp gaze locking onto him the moment he stepped inside. "I'm here to understand why holiday lights are banned this year," Mr. Miller said firmly but respectfully. "Families look forward to these displays. They bring joy, unity, and tradition. Isn't that what community is supposed to mean?" Mrs. Grayson tapped her pen impatiently. "The decision has been made. Lights create distractions, increase electricity usage, and ruin the uniform appearance of our homes. We're protecting property values. If people want lights, they can move somewhere else." One of the other board members cleared his throat as if uncomfortable with her harshness, but said nothing. The silence in the room was heavy. "Then let's compromise," Mr. Miller tried again. "What if we limit hours or brightness? There must be a middle ground." But Mrs. Grayson was unmoved. "No lights. End of discussion." She scribbled something on her notepad, then looked up coldly. "And I'll remind you, fines begin immediately if you disobey." When Mr. Miller returned home, his children rushed to him with hopeful eyes, only to see his defeated expression. "They said no," he admitted quietly. The disappointment in their faces was unbearable. Mrs. Miller placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, whispering, "We can't let her take this away from us. Not like this." As evening fell, whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. Some neighbors agreed with Mrs. Grayson, saying rules were rules. Others, however, admitted they missed the sparkle the Miller's house once brought to the street. Standing in his driveway, Mr. Miller looked at the bare roofline of his home and felt a fire growing inside him. The HOA thought they had ended the tradition, but deep down, he knew this battle was far from over. The Millers weren't just fighting for Christmas lights anymore. They were fighting for the right to bring joy back to their community. That weekend, the Miller children sat quietly in the living room, watching other kids outside building snowmen. Normally, this time of year was filled with laughter as their home glowed with lights and music. But this year, the silence felt heavier than the snow piled on the roofs. Seeing his children's disappointment cut deep into Mr. Miller's heart. Late that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, he went into the garage and opened the old storage boxes marked Christmas. He pulled out a single string of lights. Nothing extravagant, just a warm set of twinkling bulbs. Quietly, he stepped onto the porch and draped them along the railing. The glow was small, but it brought a bit of cheer back into the cold night. The next morning, the children's faces lit up brighter than the lights themselves. They ran outside, pointing and laughing with joy. Mrs. Miller smiled for the first time in days, whispering to her husband, "Thank you. It's not much, but it's something." But across the street, Mrs. Grayson was already watching. Her blinds shifted as she snapped photos with her phone. Before noon, an official letter from the HOA arrived in the Miller's mailbox. It contained a photograph of their small porch display, along with a fine notice of $200. Mrs. Miller sighed as she read the letter aloud. They wasted no time. But instead of fear, Mr. Miller felt a new resolve building inside him. That evening, neighbors began to notice the small porch display. A few stopped by with quiet words of encouragement. "We've missed this," one elderly couple said softly. "It doesn't feel like Christmas without your house glowing." Another whispered, "We're tired of her rules too." The encouragement meant more than the Millers could express. They realized they weren't alone. By the next night, 2 houses on the street had added small decorations of their own. A glowing wreath on one door, a modest string of lights on another roof. Mrs. Grayson fumed, sending out warnings and threatening fines, but something had shifted. The neighborhood was no longer as obedient as she expected. Though the fines loomed heavily over the Millers, their small act of defiance had sparked something greater. What began as one family's quiet rebellion was quickly becoming a movement, one that Mrs. Grayson couldn't stop so easily. Within days, Willow Creek was no longer the calm and orderly neighborhood it once was. On one side of the street, faint glimmers of wreaths, string lights, and window candles began to appear, inspired by the Millers' quiet stand. On the other, blinds snapped shut as a handful of residents complained about rule breakers and troublemakers. At the center of it all stood Mrs. Grayson, her frustration growing with each passing night. She sent out multiple notices, warning that decorations of any kind would result in escalating fines. Some residents, fearing punishment, quickly removed their lights. Others, however, held firm, whispering to one another that it was time someone stood up to the HOA's unreasonable grip. The tension reached a boiling point at the next HOA meeting. The room, normally half empty, was now packed with neighbors, some carrying folders of complaints, others simply eager to be heard. The atmosphere buzzed with unease as Mrs. Grayson took her place at the head of the table. "The HOA rules are clear," she announced firmly, though her voice carried a sharp edge. Uniformity is essential to protect our property values. These lights are disruptive and lower the quality of our neighborhood. Several hands shot up. One resident, Mr. Lewis, an older gentleman who had lived in Willow Creek for decades, spoke with emotion. Property values? These lights are about joy. The Millers have been bringing happiness to this community for years. My grandchildren look forward to their displays every season. Isn't that worth more than a so-called uniform look? Murmurs of agreement echoed around the room, but others disagreed. A young woman near the front stood to argue. Rules are rules. If we let one family break them, then what's the point of having an HOA at all? We'll have chaos. The debate grew heated. Voices overlapped, frustration spilled out, and for the first time, cracks in the HOA's authority were visible. Even some board members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they still stood firmly behind Mrs. Grayson. Meanwhile, the Millers sat quietly in the back, listening. They hadn't come to fight, but to witness. What they saw gave them hope. Neighbors defending them, pushing back against a rule that seemed more personal than practical. By the end of the meeting, no resolution was reached. Mrs. Grayson ended it abruptly, declaring that fines would continue until compliance was achieved. But the damage was done. The community was now split, and whispers of defiance carried into the night. The Millers knew then that the fight was no longer just theirs. It had become a battle between control and community spirit. The tension in Willow Creek grew heavier with each passing day. Every evening, the faint glow of scattered lights could be seen along the street. Small acts of defiance from families who were tired of being told what they could and could not do in their own homes. And while Mrs. Grayson patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard, documenting every strand of bulbs and every glowing wreath, the Millers were quietly preparing for something bigger. After the fiery HOA meeting, Mr. Miller couldn't stop thinking about the bylaws. Late into the night, he sat at the kitchen table with a stack of documents he had requested from the HOA. Mrs. Miller joined him, helping to highlight sections and take notes. What they discovered left them stunned. Nowhere in the official HOA handbook did it state that holiday decorations were banned. There were vague guidelines about maintaining neighborhood appearance, but no rule outright prohibited Christmas lights. This whole thing, Mrs. Miller whispered, pointing at the highlighted text, it's all her. Mrs. Grayson has been twisting the rules to fit her opinion. Mr. Miller leaned back in his chair, a spark of determination in his eyes. Then it's time we use her own rules against her. The next morning, he reached out to a few supportive neighbors, those who had spoken up at the meeting, as well as those who had quietly expressed encouragement. In hushed conversations over fences and during quick doorstep chats, he explained what they had found. Neighbors listened, nodding, their frustration mirrored in their expressions. Together, they began to plan. The Millers would collect signatures from residents who disagreed with the so-called ban. They would present the truth at the next HOA meeting, not just with arguments, but with evidence straight from the bylaws themselves. And if Mrs. Grayson tried to silence them, they would have the backing of dozens of voices demanding change. Meanwhile, their children, unaware of the late-night strategy sessions, simply asked if they would ever get to see their home shine again. Mr. Miller knelt beside them and said with quiet confidence, "Soon. Very soon." As the days passed, support for the Millers grew. Families who had been too afraid to decorate began reaching out, offering to help however they could. A neighborhood once bound by silence was beginning to stir with unity. Mrs. Grayson believed she had complete control, but the Millers now held something far stronger than power: They held truth, community, and a plan that would turn the entire battle upside down. The night of the next HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in Willow Creek was unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced before. Normally, only a handful of residents would attend, most sitting quietly while Mrs. Grayson and the board handled business. But this time, nearly every chair in the clubhouse was filled. Families who rarely spoke up were present, clutching papers, notes, and even photographs of their own small decorations. The Millers walked in quietly, carrying a neatly organized folder of highlighted bylaws, signatures, and letters of support. Their children sat with a kind neighbor in the back, eager but too young to understand the weight of what was about to happen. Mrs. Grayson opened the meeting with her usual stern tone. "Tonight, we will be addressing the ongoing issue of non-compliance with neighborhood standards. As you all know, holiday lights are strictly prohibited, and fines will continue until all violations are resolved." The room stirred with murmurs. Several residents shook their heads, some whispering angrily. For once, people weren't willing to sit in silence. Mr. Miller rose to his feet. His calm but steady voice carried across the room. "With respect, Mrs. Grayson, that statement is not accurate. Nowhere in the HOA bylaws does it state that holiday decorations are banned. I have here the official handbook, and I've highlighted every section related to exterior appearances." He placed the folder on the table in front of the board members. All eyes turned to the papers, and even some of the board leaned in with surprise. Mrs. Grayson's face tightened. "The rules are meant to maintain order. Decorations disrupt the uniformity and—" "Order," Mr. Miller interrupted politely, "is not the same as control. You have interpreted the rules to suit your own preference. But the fact remains, there is no rule here that prohibits Christmas lights." Several neighbors clapped softly, while others raised their hands to speak. One elderly man stood. "My grandchildren come here every year just to see the Miller house. You call it tacky. I call it tradition. We're tired of being silenced." Another resident added, "This is our neighborhood too, not just yours. We deserve a voice." The room grew louder as more residents chimed in. Some who had remained silent for years finally spoke up, admitting they had felt bullied into compliance. Others pointed out that traditions and individuality were what made a community feel alive, not uniform restrictions. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Clearly, they hadn't expected such overwhelming resistance. One of them finally leaned toward Mrs. Grayson and whispered something, but her scowl only deepened. "You're all being unreasonable," she snapped. "Without strict rules, this neighborhood will fall apart." But her words no longer carried the same weight. The room erupted in voices. Voices of families, of parents, of neighbors who had once been afraid, but now stood united. Mr. Miller remained calm. "We aren't here to break rules. We're here to follow them fairly. And fairness means holiday lights are allowed. The community has spoken." For the first time, Mrs. Grayson looked shaken. The power she once held so firmly in her grasp was slipping away. The clubhouse was alive with voices, a storm of long-suppressed frustrations finally breaking free. Residents who had once stayed silent now stood tall, demanding change. For years, Mrs. Grayson's word had been treated as law. But tonight, the truth had cracked her authority wide open. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the noise grew. One of them, Mr. Daniels, finally raised his hand to quiet the room. His voice was steady but carried a note of weariness. "I've reviewed the handbook myself, and Mr. Miller is correct. There is no written rule banning holiday decorations. We cannot continue to fine residents for something not supported in the bylaws." Gasps and murmurs swept across the room. For the first time, Mrs. Grayson had been publicly contradicted by her own board. Her face flushed crimson and she slammed her pen onto the table. "You're undermining years of work to protect this neighborhood. Without discipline, we'll become a circus." But her words fell flat. A young mother stood from the back row, her voice trembling but strong. "No. A circus is a place where joy lives. Right now, this feels like a prison. I'd rather live in a community full of light and laughter than one where fear of fines hangs over our heads." Applause broke out. More neighbors joined in, clapping, cheering, even stomping their feet. The sound filled the clubhouse, drowning out Mrs. Grayson's protests. The board, realizing the tide had turned, voted on the spot. Holiday decorations were officially permitted, so long as they didn't cause safety hazards. It was a simple compromise, one that gave families back their freedom. The decision passed with overwhelming support. Mrs. Grayson, defeated, gathered her papers and stormed out without another word. The door slammed behind her, leaving the room buzzing with relief and excitement. That night, the Millers returned home to their children, who had stayed up late waiting for news. When Mr. Miller knelt down and said, "We won," their squeals of joy filled the house. Without wasting a moment, the family carried boxes of lights to the yard. Neighbors soon joined in, offering ladders, extension cords, and extra decorations. By the end of the weekend, the Miller home was transformed into a dazzling wonderland. Strings of multicolored bulbs wrapped around every tree and window. Reindeer and snowmen stood proudly on the lawn. Music played softly in sync with lights that danced in perfect rhythm. But what made it truly magical was not just the Miller house. It was the entire street. One by one, families added their own touches. A glowing wreath here, a shining star there, and within days, Willow Creek had become brighter than anyone had ever imagined. Cars began driving in from other neighborhoods, lining up just to see the spectacle. Children pressed their faces to car windows in awe. News outlets even caught wind of the story, dubbing the Miller's house the brightest in the state. Standing in his driveway one snowy evening, Mr. Miller watched as his children laughed with friends under the glow of thousands of lights. Mrs. Miller slipped her hand into his, whispering, "This is what Christmas is supposed to feel like." And as neighbors gathered together, sipping cocoa, sharing cookies, and admiring the lights, it became clear that this was no longer just about decorations. It was about unity, about standing up for joy, for tradition, and for each other. For years, Willow Creek had been a neighborhood ruled by fear of fines. But that winter, it became a community, brighter, stronger, and closer than ever before. And at the heart of it all was the Miller family, whose refusal to back down had reminded everyone of the true meaning of the season: light in the darkness and hope in every home.